Have you ever wondered what happens when we die? I never did, until that night in my grandmother's cabin. What I experienced there changed everything I thought I knew about life and death. The whispers I heard, the secrets revealed, they still haunt me today. Before I dive into my story, I need to warn you. What you're about to hear might keep you up at night, questioning every creak in your floorboards, every shadow in the corner of your room. If that sounds like something you might enjoy, then get comfortable, maybe dim the lights a little, and prepare yourself for what I'm about to share. If you've ever lost someone close to you, you might understand the desperate longing to hear their voice just one more time. But trust me when I say, sometimes, it's better when the dead stay silent. The story I'm about to tell you is now beginning. It was late October in rural Vermont, when the maple trees burn with autumn fire and the air carries a knife-edged chill that cuts straight to the bone. My grandmother had passed away 3 weeks earlier. Pancreatic cancer, quick and merciless. I'd flown in from Arizona for the funeral, but now I was back, alone in her cabin, tasked with sorting through her belongings before the property was sold. The cabin sat nestled in a small clearing, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to press in closer each night. During the day, sunlight filtered through the trees, dappling the ground with warm patches of gold. But once darkness fell, well, that's when the woods seemed to breathe with a life of their own. I'd arrived late Friday afternoon. I remember checking my phone as I pulled into the gravel driveway, no service, of course. Grandma Ruth had always been proud of being off the grid. No Wi-Fi, spotty cell reception at best, just landline and solitude. "It's good for the soul, Ellie," she used to tell me. "Too much noise in the world these days." I smiled at the memory as I unlocked the front door, the key sticking slightly in the old brass lock. The cabin smelled exactly as I remembered. Cedar, old books, and the lingering scent of her cinnamon tea. The electricity was still on, thankfully, but the place felt cold, empty in a way that went beyond temperature. I flicked on lights as I moved through the small rooms, trying to push back the shadows that seemed to follow me. My footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors, each creak a reminder that I was alone here. I made myself a quick dinner from the supplies I'd brought, then settled in the small living room with a glass of wine. Grandma's old record player sat in the corner, her collection of vinyl neatly stacked beside it. On impulse, I selected one, Billie Holiday, and set the needle. The warm, crackling sound filled the cabin, momentarily chasing away the silence. As night fully descended, I began to tackle the bookshelves. Grandma had been an avid reader, her collection eclectic and vast. I sorted them into piles, keep, donate, sell, working methodically as the record played on. That's when I found it, tucked between a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird and a field guide to New England birds. A small leather-bound journal I'd never seen before. The cover was soft with age, the pages yellowed at the edges. Inside, I recognized my grandmother's neat, slanted handwriting. May 15th, 1973. I've decided to begin this record. What's happening in this house cannot be explained by conventional means. I nearly dropped the journal. My grandmother, the most practical, no-nonsense woman I'd ever known, writing about unexplainable phenomena. I poured another glass of wine and settled deeper into the armchair. The entries were sporadic at first, detailing strange occurrences. Items moved from where she'd left them. Doors found open that she was certain she'd closed. The sensation of being watched while she slept. Then, as the months progressed, the entries became more specific. November 3rd, 1973. The whispering has begun again. It always starts after midnight, coming from the walls in the northeast corner. Words I can almost, but not quite, understand. Like listening to a conversation underwater. I glanced up, suddenly aware that the record had stopped playing. The silence in the cabin felt oppressive now, weighted. Outside, the wind had picked up, branches scraping against the windows like bony fingers seeking entrance. I checked my watch, 11:47 p.m. With a shiver, I continued reading. December 21st, 1973. Winter solstice. The longest night. They say the veil between worlds is thinnest now. I finally understand what the voice has been trying to tell me. It's about the ground beneath the old oak. What's buried there isn't what everyone believes. My breath caught. The old oak. I knew exactly which tree she meant. A massive, gnarled thing that dominated the edge of the clearing. I'd climbed it countless times as a child, built a fort in its branches one summer. Never once had I thought about what might be beneath it. Just then, the grandfather clock in the hallway began to chime midnight. Each resonant gong seemed to vibrate through my chest, and as the 12th chime faded, I heard it. A whisper, so faint I might have imagined it, coming from the northeast corner of the living room. Eleanor. My name, just my name, but spoken in a voice that was not my grandmother's, not anyone's I recognized. I froze, the journal forgotten in my lap, every muscle tensed. Eleanor, listen. The voice was clearer now, still whisper-soft but undeniably there. A woman's voice, young, urgent. The oak, beneath the oak. I'm not proud of what happened next. I bolted, left the journal on the chair, grabbed my coat and car keys and burst out of the cabin into the frigid night air. My breath came in white plumes as I fumbled with the car door, hands shaking so badly I dropped the keys in the gravel. As I bent to retrieve them, my gaze was drawn to the edge of the clearing. The old oak stood silhouetted against the night sky, its bare branches reaching like supplicating arms toward the stars, and beneath it, a flicker of movement. A pale shape, there and gone so quickly I couldn't be certain I'd seen anything at all. I drove into town that night, checked into the small motel on Main Street, and told myself I'd return to the cabin in daylight. When things felt safer, more normal. I told myself the voice had been the wind, or my imagination stimulated by the journal's eerie contents. But deep down, I knew something in that cabin had called my name, and whatever secrets lay beneath the old oak tree, they were waiting for me to uncover them. I barely slept that night at the Pinecone Motel. The heater rattled and clanked. The sheets smelled vaguely of industrial bleach, and every time I closed my eyes, I heard that whisper again. Eleanor, beneath the oak. I woke well before dawn, my heart pounding, the echo of that voice still ringing in my ears. By the time the sun rose, I'd convinced myself I'd overreacted. Lack of sleep, the emotional weight of Grandma Ruth's death, an old house with normal settling noises, and a vivid imagination fueled by an unexpected journal. That's all it had been. Nothing supernatural or sinister. I stopped at Maggie's diner for breakfast, where the waitress, Darlene, according to her name tag, seemed to recognize me immediately. You're Ruth Blackwood's granddaughter, aren't you? Those eyes, spitting image of her when she was young. I nodded, surprised. You knew my grandmother. Honey, everyone in Oak Ridge knew Ruth. She poured my coffee with a practiced hand. Strong woman, kept to herself mostly, especially after your grandfather passed. How are you holding up out at that cabin all alone? I actually stayed in town last night. Something in my tone must have given me away because Darlene's expression shifted subtly. Cabin got to you, did it? Those old places, they hold on to things, if you know what I mean. I wasn't sure I did, but I nodded anyway, eager for her to continue. Darlene glanced around the nearly empty diner, then leaned closer. Your grandma's place, it has a history. That land was part of the old Harlow property before your grandparents bought it in '72. There were stories. What kind of stories? I asked, my voice sounding strained even to my own ears. Nothing worth repeating over breakfast. She straightened, her professional smile returning. Just old town gossip. You need anything else with that coffee, hun? I ordered eggs and toast I barely tasted, my mind racing. Back in my rental car, I hesitated. I could drive back to the cabin now, continue packing up Grandma's belongings in the bright safety of daylight. Or I could make a detour. 20 minutes later, I pushed open the heavy wooden door of the Oak Ridge Historical Society. A bell tinkled softly overhead, and an elderly man peered at me from behind a cluttered desk. "Can I help you, miss?" "I hope so. I'm researching the history of my grandmother's property, Ruth Blackwood's cabin just off Pinewood Road. I understand it was once part of something called the Harlow property." The man's bushy eyebrows rose slightly. "The Blackwood place, yes. Interesting parcel of land. The Harlow estate originally covered most of the northern woods. Beautiful old Victorian mansion stood about a mile from where your grandmother's cabin is now. Burned down in 1947. Terrible tragedy." "What happened?" He retrieved a large leather-bound book from a nearby shelf, flipping through yellowed pages with careful fingers. "Here we are. The Harlow fire. Catherine Harlow and her young daughter, Margaret, both perished. Only survivor was William Harlow, the husband, who was in Boston on business when it happened." He turned the book toward me. A newspaper clipping showed the blackened skeleton of what must have been an impressive home, smoke still rising from the ruins. The headline read, "Midnight Blaze Claims Mother and Child." "The property sat abandoned for years after that," the man continued. "William Harlow never returned to Oak Ridge. Eventually, the land was parceled and sold. Your grandparents purchased their section in the early 70s, built that cabin themselves. And the old oak tree at the edge of the clearing, was that part of the Harlow property too?" Something flickered across the man's face, caution perhaps. "The witness oak," locals called it. Been standing for hundreds of years. "Why do you ask about the tree specifically?" I hesitated, unwilling to share the journal's contents or my experience from the previous night. "Just curious. It's an impressive tree." "Indeed." He closed the book with a finality that suggested our conversation was nearing its end. "The Historical Society has more detailed records if you're interested in researching further. Land surveys, property maps, that sort of thing. Though I have to wonder why a young woman from Arizona, is it, would be so interested in old Oak Ridge history." "Just feeling connected to my roots, I guess," I offered lamely. Back in my car, I sat for a long moment processing what I'd learned. A mansion fire. A mother and daughter who died in 1947. My grandparents building their cabin in the early 70s, around the same time Grandma started her journal about strange occurrences. And a tree called the witness oak. I didn't want to return to the cabin. Every instinct told me to drive back to the airport, fly home to Phoenix and let some real estate agent handle Grandma's belongings. But I couldn't. Not just because I'd promised my parents I'd take care of things, but because I needed to know what was beneath that oak tree. The cabin looked deceptively peaceful in the midday sun. Birds chirped in the surrounding woods and a gentle breeze stirred the fallen leaves. Nothing about it hinted at the unnerving experience I'd had the night before. Inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it. The journal still lay open on the armchair. Billie Holiday's record still on the turntable. I moved through the room slowly, alert for any sound or sensation out of the ordinary. Nothing. I picked up the journal again, flipping further into its pages. January 10th, 1974. I've told Henry about the voices. He thinks I'm working too hard on the renovation, not getting enough sleep. He suggested I see Dr. Farrow. I've agreed, but only to appease him. I know what I'm hearing isn't exhaustion or imagination. January 15th, 1974. Dr. Farrow has prescribed pills to help me sleep. I flush them down the toilet. I need to stay alert, especially at night. The voice is becoming clearer. Last night, I finally understood a complete sentence. She knows where it is. February 2nd, 1974. I've started researching the history of this land. The Harlow fire wasn't an accident. Catherine knew something. Something about her husband that put her and little Margaret in danger. And whatever proof she had, she hid it somewhere on this property before the fire. I closed the journal, a chill running up my spine despite the warm sunlight streaming through the windows. My practical, sensible grandmother had been convinced that the tragic fire from decades ago hadn't been an accident, and that the evidence was hidden somewhere on the property. Beneath the oak. Outside, I approached the massive tree cautiously, as if it might somehow be aware of my presence. Its trunk was so wide that it would take 3 people with outstretched arms to encircle it. Roots erupted from the ground like massive serpents before disappearing back into the earth. What exactly was I looking for? A box? A container of some kind? The ground around the tree showed no signs of recent disturbance, just a thick carpet of fallen leaves and moss. If something was buried here, it had been here a very long time. I returned to the shed behind the cabin, rummaging until I found a rusty shovel. Then, feeling slightly foolish, I began to dig beneath the oak's spreading branches. The soil was hard, compacted by years of rainfall and the weight of the mighty tree above. My hands quickly blistered, unused to such labor. After an hour of digging, I'd created a hole about 2 feet deep and found nothing but dirt, rocks, and tree roots. Sweat trickled down my back despite the cool air. This was ridiculous. What was I doing? Digging up my grandmother's property based on a cryptic journal and a whisper that was probably just the wind. Frustrated, I drove the shovel into the ground one last time and hit something solid. Not rock, metal. My heart racing, I dropped to my knees, brushing away soil with my bare hands. Gradually, a small metal box emerged, a lockbox, rusted but intact, about the size of a thick hardcover book. It had no visible keyhole, just a simple latch. With trembling fingers, I released the latch. Inside, protected from the elements, lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. I carefully unwrapped it to reveal a stack of papers, letters from the look of them, and something else, a small leather pouch. As I reached for the pouch, a sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, so strong it nearly knocked me sideways. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant. And there it was again. That whisper, no longer confined to the cabin's walls. "Eleanor, you found it?" I spun around, the box clutched to my chest. The clearing was empty, the woods silent, but I could feel it. A presence, watching, waiting, not threatening, expectant. The sun had begun its descent toward the horizon. Soon it would be dark, and I did not want to be outside when night fell. Gathering the box and shovel, I hurried back to the cabin, locking the door firmly behind me. At the kitchen table, I carefully examined my find. The letters were correspondence between Catherine Harlow and her sister in Boston, dated throughout 1947, the year of the fire. I skimmed them quickly at first, then more carefully as their significance became clear. March 12, 1947. Dearest Eliza, William's behavior grows more concerning by the day. Last night, I found him burning papers in his study at 3 a.m. When questioned, he flew into such a rage that I feared for my safety. Something is terribly wrong with his business affairs. I've overheard telephone conversations that suggest he's involved in something illegal. April 29, 1947. Dearest Eliza, I've discovered the truth, and it's worse than I imagined. The investments, the sudden wealth, it's all built on fraud. William has been operating a scheme that has ruined countless families. I've gathered evidence, documents that prove everything. If anything should happen to me, look for the oak. What's buried there will tell the truth. The final letter was dated just 2 days before the fire. With shaking hands, I opened the leather pouch. Inside was a delicate gold locket on a thin chain. I carefully prized it open to find a tiny photograph of a woman and a young girl, both smiling at the camera. On the opposite side, an inscription, Catherine and Margaret, always. As the last light of day faded from the windows, I sat surrounded by the evidence of a decades-old crime. A fraud, a murder disguised as an accident, a secret buried beneath an ancient oak. My grandmother had somehow sensed it, heard the echoes of a tragedy that had occurred long before she ever set foot on this land. And now, somehow, Catherine Harlow had reached out to me as well. As darkness enveloped the cabin, I felt a presence settling around me like a fog. Not malevolent, but insistent. Waiting. There was something else I needed to do, something unfinished. The grandfather clock struck 9, each chime reverberating through the silent cabin. Outside, the wind had picked up again, moaning through the trees like a distant cry. I'd spread Catherine Harlow's letters across the kitchen table, reading and rereading them, trying to piece together the full story. William Harlow had orchestrated an investment scheme that defrauded dozens of families in the Boston area. When Catherine discovered evidence of his crimes, she hid it where she thought it would be safe, beneath the ancient oak tree on their property. Had she planned to go to the authorities? Did William somehow discover her intentions? The final letter to her sister contained a chilling line. He returns from Boston tomorrow. I fear what may happen when he realizes what I know. 2 days later, Catherine and her daughter were dead in a fire ruled accidental. William Harlow, conveniently away on business, inherited everything and promptly sold the land, never to return to Oak Ridge. But there was still a piece missing. The letters mentioned evidence, documents that would prove William's crimes. I'd found the letters and the locket, but nothing that would concretely implicate William Harlow in financial fraud, let alone murder. A soft tapping sound drew my attention to the window. Just a branch, I told myself. But when I looked up, a small pale face peered back at me through the glass. I screamed, nearly toppling my chair as I scrambled backward. The face vanished instantly. Heart pounding, I approached the window cautiously. Nothing there, just darkness and the reflection of the kitchen lights on the glass. "You're scaring yourself, Ellie," I muttered, running a shaky hand through my hair. Get it together. I decided I needed something stronger than wine. In the small living room cabinet where Grandma kept her liquor, I found an ancient bottle of whiskey. The first sip burned going down, but the second felt smoother, steadying my nerves. Returning to the kitchen, I froze in the doorway. The letters on the table had moved, not scattered by a draft, deliberately arranged in a different order, with certain words now aligned to form a new message. Look again beneath the boards where the light falls at midnight. "Hello?" My voice sounded thin, frightened. "Catherine, is that you?" The temperature in the kitchen plummeted so rapidly I could see my breath cloud in front of my face. The overhead light flickered once, twice, then stabilized. "I found your letters," I said to the empty room, feeling simultaneously ridiculous and terrified. "I know what William did, but what do you want me to do about it now? It's been over 70 years. William must be long dead." No response, just the persistent chill and a sense of being watched by unseen eyes. Clutching my whiskey glass like a talisman, I moved through the cabin, checking locks on doors and windows. As I passed the guest bedroom, my bedroom during this stay, I noticed something odd. A shaft of moonlight streaming through the window fell directly on a specific floorboard near the foot of the bed. Where the light falls, without conscious decision, I found myself kneeling on the cold floor, my fingers searching for any irregularity in the wooden boards. There, a slight gap, wider than the others. I pressed down on one end of the board and felt the opposite end lift slightly. Using a letter opener from the desk, I carefully pried up the board, then another beside it. A small space was revealed beneath, and in it a thick manila envelope, its edges brittle with age. Inside were bank statements, contracts, and handwritten ledgers. Financial documents that meant little to me, but would have told a damning story to the authorities in 1947. And beneath them, something else. A journal, much like my grandmother's, but older. The first page bore a name in elegant script, Catherine Elizabeth Harlow. I opened it with reverent care, the pages so fragile they threatened to crumble beneath my fingers. October 3rd, 1947. I can delay no longer. William returns tomorrow, and I must act. The evidence is prepared. One copy beneath the oak where Eliza knows to look. Another here beneath the floorboards. Tomorrow I will take Margaret and go to the police, then to Eliza's in Boston until this nightmare ends. I fear for our safety. William's rage when crossed is terrible, and what I've discovered will destroy him, the money, the status he values above all else, gone when the truth emerges. Last night I dreamed of fire, of Margaret calling for me through the smoke. Just a nightmare, I tell myself, but I cannot shake its grip. That was the final entry. The next day, Catherine had presumably hidden one set of evidence beneath the oak tree. And that night, instead of escaping to Boston as planned, she and Margaret had died in flames. "You never made it to the police," I whispered. "He came back early, didn't he? He stopped you." The window beside me fogged over, as if breathed upon by invisible lips. In the condensation, a single word formed. "Yes." I should have been paralyzed with fear. Instead, a strange calm settled over me. "That's why you've been trying to reach out all these years. First to my grandmother, now to me. You want justice." Another word formed on the glass. "Margaret." My throat tightened. "Your daughter. You want justice for Margaret." The whisper returned, surrounding me, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Tell our story." I gathered all the documents, Catherine's letters, journal, and the financial evidence, and brought them to the kitchen table. The modern world had forgotten William Harlow's crimes, but perhaps it wasn't too late for the truth to emerge. As midnight approached, I made a decision. I would take everything to the Historical Society, to the local police if necessary. After 70 years, Catherine and Margaret Harlow would finally have their voices heard. The grandfather clock began to chime 12. As the final note faded, a soft crackle emanated from the corner of the living room. Grandma's record player had switched on by itself. Billie Holiday's haunting voice filled the cabin, singing about strange fruit. And then I saw her. Not a glimpse or a shadow this time, but a full apparition. A young woman in a 1940s dress, her hair styled in elegant waves, standing by the window. Beside her, holding her hand, was a small girl in a nightgown, perhaps 7 or 8 years old. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. In their transparent faces I saw gratitude and a final farewell. As Billie Holiday's song ended, they faded like morning mist under a rising sun. The oppressive feeling that had permeated the cabin lifted, replaced by an ordinary stillness. The simple quiet of an empty house. Outside, the wind had stopped. The branches no longer scraped against the windows. For the first time since arriving, I felt I could breathe freely within these walls. I slept that night without fear, the documents secure beside my bed. In the morning, I would begin the process of bringing Catherine and Margaret's story to light. But for now, I rested in the knowledge that sometimes the dead speak not out of malice or vengeance, but from a simple human need that transcends even death itself. The need to be heard, to have one's truth acknowledged. And sometimes the living are meant to listen. The sleepy town of Oak Ridge awoke to unexpected commotion the next morning. I'd arrived at the police station as soon as it opened, a cardboard box containing Catherine Harlow's documents clutched in my arms. Chief Daniel Morris, a weathered man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and skeptical eyes, listened to my story with remarkable patience. "Let me get this straight, Miss Blackwood," he said, leaning back in his creaking office chair. "You're saying William Harlow, one of the town's most respected historical figures, committed fraud and then murdered his wife and daughter in 1947, and you know this because their ghosts told you?" Put that way, it sounded absurd. I felt heat rise to my cheeks. Not exactly. I found evidence, real, physical evidence, hidden on my grandmother's property. The supernatural elements are just how I was led to it. Chief Morris sighed, rubbing his temples. Look, I appreciate you bringing this in. Truly. But even if these documents prove some kind of financial wrongdoing, which would be long past any statute of limitations, there's nothing here that definitively proves the fire wasn't accidental. But the timing is circumstantial at best. His tone was gentle but firm. I'll have Officer Reyes scan these documents for our records and pass copies to the Historical Society since they have an interest in town history. But I need to be straight with you. This isn't going to lead to any kind of posthumous prosecution. I nodded, deflated but not surprised. I understand. I promised I'd tell their story. Something in my voice must have reached him because his expression softened. Tell you what, Joanne, over at the Oak Ridge Gazette, might be interested in this. She's always digging into historical pieces for the paper. It's not justice in the legal sense, but it would get the story out there. That afternoon, I sat across from Joanne Wilson, editor of the small weekly newspaper, watching as she carefully examined Catherine's journal. Her office was cluttered with stacks of old editions, reference books, and framed front pages from significant moments in the town's history. "This is remarkable," she said finally, looking up at me with wide eyes. I've written about the Harlow fire before. It's one of those defining tragedies in local history. But this changes everything. You believe me? The documents speak for themselves. She tapped Catherine's journal. And I've always thought there was something off about the official account. William Harlow liquidated his assets and disappeared to Europe less than a month after the fire. People chalked it up to grief, but it looks different when you know he was running from evidence his wife had uncovered, I finished. Exactly. Joanne leaned forward, her eyes bright with journalistic fervor. Here's what I'm thinking, a special edition. The truth about the Harlow fire. A 75-year-old cold case reopened. We publish Catherine's final journal entries, excerpts from the letters, analysis of the financial documents. And the supernatural elements, the way I found everything? She hesitated. That's trickier. No offense, but I'd like to focus on the verifiable facts. The documents themselves are sensational enough without adding ghost stories to the mix. I understood her position, but it felt wrong to excise Catherine and Margaret's presence from their own story. What if we compromise? You focus on the historical evidence in your main piece, and I write a companion personal essay about my experience at the cabin. Readers can decide for themselves what to believe about that part. Joanne considered this, then nodded slowly. That could work. Might even sell more papers, to be honest. The final entry offered a clue. April 30th, 1974. The voices have stopped. I've made my peace with whatever, or whoever, inhabits this land with us. Some might call me crazy for saying this, but I feel protective of them now, these unseen presences. They have their reasons for remaining. Perhaps someday someone will help them find their way to whatever comes next. She'd known. On some level, my no-nonsense grandmother had understood that she was sharing her home with echoes of a past tragedy, and she'd somehow sensed that eventually someone would come who could help them. The special edition of the Oak Ridge Gazette was published on Thursday, creating exactly the stir Joanne had hoped for. Prominent businessman's dark secret revealed 75 years later, the headline proclaimed. Beside it, in smaller type, a granddaughter's strange experience in the Blackwood cabin. By Friday, the story had been picked up by several regional news outlets. By the following Monday, a true crime podcast had reached out for an interview. Catherine and Margaret's story was spreading, their truth finally emerging from decades of silence. On my final night in the cabin, I sat on the porch swing, watching as twilight settled over the clearing. The old oak stood majestic against the darkening sky, its secrets finally revealed. In the morning, I would drive to Boston to catch my flight back to Phoenix, leaving Vermont and its ghosts behind. I kept my promise, I said, softly to the evening air. Your story has been told. No whisper answered me. No spectral figures appeared. But as the first stars emerged overhead, a profound sense of completion settled over me. Whatever had bound Catherine and Margaret Harlow to this place for 75 years had been loosened, if not fully released. Back in Arizona, I kept in touch with Joanne, who reported that interest in the Harlow case continued to grow. A historian from Boston had begun researching the investment fraud angle, discovering connections to several previously unexplained financial collapses from that era. William Harlow, it seemed, had left more victims than just his wife and daughter. 6 months later, I received a small package from the Oak Ridge Historical Society. Inside was a note from the elderly curator I'd met during my visit. Miss Blackwood. During recent renovations of our archive room, we discovered this photograph tucked inside a book about local architecture. I thought you might appreciate having it. Regards, Howard Jenkins. The photograph showed the Harlow mansion in its prime, a magnificent Victorian house surrounded by manicured gardens. But what caught my eye was the oak tree visible at the edge of the frame, younger but unmistakable, and the two figures standing beneath it. A woman and a small girl, their faces too distant to make out clearly, but their postures suggesting joy, ease, belonging. I had the photograph framed and hung it in my study. Sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I look at it and wonder about the thin places between this world and whatever lies beyond. About voices that echo across the boundaries of death itself. About justice delayed but not forgotten. After all, some stories refuse to remain buried. Some truths will always find a way to be heard. And sometimes, if we're very lucky or very cursed, we might just hear an echo from beyond the grave. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced something that couldn't be explained? A presence you couldn't see but somehow felt? A voice from someone long gone? And if you enjoyed this journey into the space between worlds, please consider subscribing to the channel. There are more stories waiting to be told, more echoes waiting to be heard. Some perhaps closer to you than you realize. Sleep well tonight, and listen carefully to the whispers in your own walls. Story number 2. Hey there, fellow mystery lovers. Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to thank you for tuning in to another episode of Whispered Mysteries. Your support means everything. And tonight's tale? Well, it might just keep you up past your bedtime. If you're new here, you're in for a treat. But, fair warning, some listeners have reported strange dreams after hearing my stories. Is that just coincidence? Maybe. But I'd love to hear about your experiences in the comments below. And if you enjoy getting the chills while cozied up in bed, consider subscribing. Now, turn down your lights, get comfortable, and let's begin our journey into the unknown. The story you're about to hear is called The Lost Hiker Who Left No Evidence Behind. The Appalachian Trail stretches over 2,000 miles from Georgia to Maine, cutting through some of the most beautiful wilderness in America. Thousands of hikers attempt to conquer it each year. Some make it, some don't. My name is Daniel Cooper. I've been a park ranger at the Shenandoah National Park for 12 years now. I've seen almost everything these mountains can throw at a person. Flash floods, wildlife encounters, injuries, and yes, people who've gotten lost. But nothing prepared me for what happened to Marcus Reeves. It was late September last year. The leaves were just starting to turn, painting the mountains in brushstrokes of amber and crimson. The air had that particular crispness that only comes with early fall in Virginia. Perfect hiking weather, as we like to say. Marcus was an experienced hiker. 32 years old, former military, in excellent physical condition. He'd completed parts of the Pacific Crest Trail the year before, and was working his way through the AT sections. He wasn't some unprepared tourist who wandered off the designated path wearing sneakers and carrying nothing but a bottle of water. Marcus knew what he was doing. He checked in at the ranger station on a Tuesday morning. I remember because I was the one who spoke with him. We chatted about trail conditions, weather forecasts, and his planned route. He was going to cover about 15 miles that day, camp overnight, and then continue on for another 3 days before reaching the next road access point where a friend would pick him up. "Weather looks good for the next few days," I told him, checking my computer. "Just be aware we've had some unusual wildlife activity in the eastern sector." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Bears?" "No, just strange reports from hikers, probably nothing." I hesitated, not wanting to sound ridiculous. Some hikers mentioned feeling watched. One woman said she heard someone calling her name, but she was hiking alone. Marcus smiled. "The woods play tricks on your mind when you're solo hiking. I've experienced it before." I nodded. "Just stick to the marked trails, follow your itinerary, and you'll be fine." He signed the trail register, adjusted his pack, and headed out. That was the last time anyone saw Marcus Reeves. His friend called the park office 4 days later when Marcus didn't show up at their predetermined meeting point. We immediately initiated search protocols. I coordinated with local search and rescue teams, volunteer groups, and even brought in dogs specially trained for human tracking. The search lasted 2 weeks. 2 weeks of combing every inch of that section of trail. Every ravine, every cave, every thicket. We found nothing. No backpack, no tent, no water bottle, no clothing, not even a footprint. It was as if Marcus had simply evaporated. Most missing hikers leave something behind, some trace of their presence, a clue to their fate. But Marcus? Nothing. The case went cold. The official report listed him as a missing person, presumed dead from exposure or accident. But that explanation never sat right with me. How could an experienced hiker disappear so completely? After the official search ended, I kept looking on my days off. I felt responsible somehow. I was the last park employee to see him. I kept thinking there was something I missed, some detail that would make sense of it all. It was during one of these unofficial searches, about a month after Marcus disappeared, that I found something odd. I was exploring about half a mile off the main trail, in an area we had already searched thoroughly, or so I thought. There was a small clearing I hadn't noticed before, perfectly circular, about 20 feet in diameter. The trees surrounding it seemed different somehow. Their trunks were gnarled in unusual patterns, branches twisting in ways that didn't look natural. In the center of the clearing was a single hiking boot. I recognized it immediately as the same brand Marcus had been wearing when he checked in that morning. It was positioned perfectly upright, as if someone had carefully placed it there, not tossed aside or lost in a struggle. I approached it cautiously. The boot was in pristine condition. No mud, no scuffs, it looked brand new. I took photos, documented its location with GPS, and bagged it as evidence. But when I returned to the station and pulled up Marcus's file to confirm the boot type, that's when things got truly strange. The photos from the security camera showed Marcus wearing an entirely different brand of hiking boots that day. Not even close to what I'd found. I drove back to the clearing the next morning, thinking maybe I'd made a mistake. Maybe it was just some random boot another hiker had lost. The clearing was gone. I checked my GPS coordinates multiple times, but there was nothing there. Just thick forest without a break in the canopy. No circular clearing, no twisted trees, and no boot. I began to question my own memory, my own sanity. Had I actually found anything? Or was my guilt about Marcus's disappearance causing me to imagine things? That night, I had the first dream. I was walking along the Appalachian Trail. It was dark, but I could see perfectly. The path ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, winding through trees that leaned inward, creating a tunnel effect. I heard footsteps behind me. Steady, unhurried. When I turned to look, there was no one there. But the footsteps continued. A voice whispered from the darkness between the trees. "Daniel, some hikers never leave the trail." I woke up sweating, my heart pounding. Just a nightmare, I told myself. A manifestation of stress and unresolved guilt. But the dreams continued. Night after night. Always the same trail, always the invisible footsteps following me. And always that whisper from the darkness. I started researching previous disappearances in Shenandoah and the surrounding areas of the AT. The official records showed the expected statistics. People who wandered off trails succumbed to exposure, had fatal encounters with wildlife, or suffered accidents. Normal, explicable tragedies. But online, in forums and private groups, I found hikers sharing stories that never made it into official reports. Stories of strange clearings in the woods, of people who felt watched, of voices calling their names when they were alone. And in several of these accounts, there was mention of hiking boots found in unusual places. Single boots, always in perfect condition, as if they'd never been worn at all. I needed to go back to that section of trail. I needed to find that clearing again. But something told me I shouldn't go alone. I convinced my colleague, Lisa Winters, to join me on my next day off. I didn't tell her exactly what I was looking for, just that I wanted to do one more thorough search of the area where Marcus was last believed to have been hiking. Lisa was pragmatic, level-headed, a 20-year veteran of the Park Service who had seen it all. If anyone would keep me grounded in reality, it would be her. We set out at dawn, the forest shrouded in morning mist that clung to the trees like spectral fingers. The familiar scent of pine and damp earth filled my nostrils as we hiked, bringing back memories of that strange circular clearing. "So, what exactly are we looking for, Dan?" Lisa asked after we'd been hiking for about 2 hours. "We've already searched this entire section." I hesitated. "I'm not entirely sure. Just anything unusual." Lisa gave me a look. "This isn't like you. You're usually more specific than that." I sighed. I found something about a month ago, but when I went back to document it properly, it was gone. What was it? A clearing, with a hiking boot in the center of it. She stopped walking. "And you didn't report this?" "I did go back to verify it, and there was nothing there. I thought maybe I'd imagined it." Lisa studied my face for a long moment. "You're serious?" "I know how it sounds." I ran a hand through my hair. "But there's something not right about Marcus's disappearance. No evidence, no trace. It doesn't make sense." We continued hiking in silence. I checked my GPS repeatedly, trying to find the exact location where I'd discovered the clearing. The forest seemed different now, denser somehow. The trees closer together than I remembered. Temperatures dropping, Lisa noted, zipping up her jacket. She was right. The air had suddenly turned cold, despite the morning sun now being high enough to warm the forest floor. That's when we heard it. A rhythmic sound in the distance. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on fallen leaves. Lisa looked at me, instantly alert. "Hello," she called out. "Park rangers, anyone there?" No response. But the footsteps continued, neither approaching nor retreating, just maintaining their steady pace somewhere ahead of us. We moved forward cautiously. The mist had returned, thicker now, swirling around the trunks of the trees. Visibility dropped to about 20 feet. "This isn't right," Lisa muttered. The forecast didn't mention fog. The footsteps stopped abruptly. The forest fell completely silent. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, no distant sounds of wildlife. Just the sound of our own breathing and the pounding of my heart. Then a voice called out, distant but clear. "Daniel." Lisa's head snapped toward me. "Someone knows you." I felt a cold that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. "That's..." That's exactly what the hikers reported. Hearing their names called, we stood frozen, waiting. The voice came again, closer this time. "Daniel, some hikers never leave the trail." Lisa's face drained of color. "Let's go, now." We turned to retrace our steps, but the trail behind us had changed. Where there had been a clear path, there was now dense underbrush, as if the forest had closed in behind us while we were distracted. "This isn't possible," Lisa whispered, her professional demeanor cracking for the first time. "We just came this way." I checked my GPS. According to the device, we were nowhere near the trail. We were in an unmarked section of the park that was at least a mile from any designated path. But that couldn't be right. We'd been following the trail marker blazes the entire time. "GPS malfunction," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Let's use the compass." But the compass was spinning wildly, the needle rotating in full circles without settling. The mist continued to thicken until we could barely see each other, let alone the surrounding forest. And through it all, those footsteps returned, circling us now, like a predator sizing up its prey. "We need to mark our position," Lisa said, her ranger training kicking in despite her obvious fear. She took out her knife and began to carve a marking into the nearest tree trunk. The sound that followed is difficult to describe, a high-pitched keening that seemed to come from the tree itself, as if Lisa's knife had caused it pain. She jumped back, dropping the knife. "Did you hear that?" she gasped. I nodded, unable to speak. The mist around us had taken on a faintly luminous quality, glowing with a pale bluish light that made the forest look otherworldly, and then we saw it. A circular clearing opening up ahead of us, the mist parting like a curtain to reveal it. The same perfectly round clearing I had found before, surrounded by trees with unnaturally twisted trunks. In the center, not one boot this time, but two, placed side by side, perfectly aligned, as if someone had just stepped out of them and vanished. Lisa grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in painfully. "Dan, those are my boots." I looked down at her feet. She was indeed wearing boots. The same hiking boots she always wore on trail duty, but there they were in the clearing as well. An impossible duplicate. "This isn't real," she whispered. "It can't be real." The footsteps were getting closer, coming from all directions now. Through the mist, I could make out shadows moving between the trees, human-shaped, but somehow wrong, proportions slightly off, movements too fluid to be natural. "Run," I said, pulling Lisa away from the clearing. "Don't look back." We crashed through the underbrush, thorns tearing at our clothing, branches whipping our faces. The rational part of my mind knew we were only getting more lost, that our best chance was to stay put and use our emergency locator beacons. But primal fear had taken over. We had to get away from that clearing, from those boots, from whatever was moving through the mist. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, we broke through into a familiar area, one of the designated camping sites along the Appalachian Trail. Normal sounds returned, birds calling, leaves rustling in the breeze. The mist was gone, and warm autumn sunlight dappled the ground through the colorful canopy above. Lisa and I stood there, gasping for breath, looking at each other in disbelief. "What just happened?" she finally managed to ask. I shook my head. "I don't know." We checked our GPS devices, both functioning normally now, showing our correct position on the trail. Our compasses pointed steadily north as they should, and Lisa's boots? Still on her feet, where they had been all along. Later, after we had hiked back to the ranger station in silence, Lisa looked at me with haunted eyes. "I don't want to talk about what happened today," she said firmly. "Not to anyone. They'll think we're crazy." I nodded. "I understand." "But Dan," she added, her voice lower now. "I've been a ranger for 20 years. I've never believed in anything supernatural, but whatever's out there in those woods, it's not something we can explain." That night, I dreamed again, But this time, I wasn't alone on the trail. Marcus Reeves walked beside me, his face serene, his footsteps making no sound. "Are you real?" I asked him in the dream. He smiled. "Define real, Ranger Cooper. What happened to you out there?" Marcus stopped walking and turned to face me. "Some hikers never leave the trail," he said, his voice overlapping with the whispering voices from the forest. "Some of us become part of it." I woke up with his words echoing in my mind. Part of it? What did that mean? The next morning, I called in sick. I needed time to process what had happened, to make sense of it if that was even possible. I sat at my kitchen table with a map of Shenandoah spread out before me, trying to pinpoint exactly where the circular clearing might be located. That's when I noticed it. A coffee ring on the map, perfectly circular, right over the section of forest where Lisa and I had experienced our strange encounter. I hadn't been drinking coffee while looking at the map. The ring hadn't been there when I unfolded it. As I stared at it, the brown stain seemed to darken, spreading outward like roots from the circular shape, creating a pattern across the map that looked disturbingly like the twisted trees surrounding the clearing. I blinked, and the pattern was gone. Just an ordinary coffee stain on an ordinary map. But I knew then that whatever was happening in those woods, it had followed me home. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into research, looking for patterns, for explanations. I requested records of every disappearance in Shenandoah National Park for the past 50 years. Most were resolved. Hikers found alive, bodies recovered, mysteries explained. But there were 12 cases, including Marcus Reeves, where people had vanished without a trace. No bodies, no equipment, no evidence left behind. Just empty woods and unanswered questions. I created a map, marking the last known locations of each disappearance. When viewed together, they formed a pattern. A large circle, approximately 5 miles in diameter, with a central point deep in one of the most remote sections of the park. I hadn't told anyone about my findings or my experiences, not even Lisa, who had been avoiding me since our encounter in the woods, but I needed answers, and I knew I couldn't find them alone. There was one person who might help, Dr. Eleanor Reed, an anthropologist who had spent years studying the folklore and history of the Blue Ridge Mountains. I'd met her once at a Park Service conference where she'd given a presentation on the cultural significance of the Appalachian Trail. I drove to her office at the University of Virginia on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Her academic credentials gave her an air of respectability that made me feel slightly less crazy about what I was about to share. Dr. Reed was in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and keen eyes that missed nothing. She listened without interruption as I told her everything. Marcus's disappearance, the strange clearing, the boots, the experience with Lisa, and the pattern of disappearances I'd discovered. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment, studying the map I'd brought with me. "You think I'm crazy," I finally said. She looked up. "No, Ranger Cooper. I think you've encountered something very old." She pulled a book from her shelf, a worn volume bound in faded green cloth. The indigenous peoples who lived in these mountains long before European settlers arrived had stories. Stories about places in the forest where the boundary between our world and something else grows thin. She opened the book to a marked page. They called them spirit circles, places where a person could step from one world into another. Most were believed to be temporary, appearing and disappearing with the phases of the moon or changing seasons, but some were permanent. Dr. Reed pointed to the center of the circle I'd drawn on my map. This area was considered sacred and dangerous by the local tribes. They warned that those who entered unprepared might find themselves walking a path with no return. "But that's just folklore," I said, even as the rational part of my mind struggled with what I'd experienced. "There has to be a scientific explanation." "Perhaps," she conceded. "But consider this. Many cultures throughout history have independently developed similar concepts. Fairy rings in European folklore, where those who step inside are transported to another realm. The Japanese have kamikakushi, being spirited away by gods or demons. These stories persist across time and geography. She closed the book. Science can't yet explain everything we experience, Ranger Cooper. Sometimes the old stories contain truths we've forgotten. I left Dr. Reed's office with more questions than answers, but also with a strange sense of validation. Someone else, someone with credentials and authority, didn't think I was losing my mind. That night, I dreamed again of the trail. But this time it wasn't just Marcus walking beside me. There were others. Men and women in hiking gear from different eras, their appearances corresponding to the dates of the disappearances I'd researched. They walked in silence, their expressions peaceful as they moved among trees that gradually became less tree-like and more something else. Structures that resembled trees but moved with a sentience that trees shouldn't possess. "What do you want from me?" I asked the silent hikers. One of them, a woman in hiking gear from the 1970s according to my research, turned to me. "Nothing, Daniel," she said softly. "We're just showing you the path." "Path to where?" "To understanding," Marcus answered, appearing beside her. "Few can see the circles for what they are. Fewer still can leave them once they've entered. You're different." I woke up with the first light of dawn, the dream still vivid in my mind. You're different. What did that mean? I called in sick again, knowing what I had to do. I needed to find the center of that circle on my map. I needed to see what was there, but as I was packing my gear, there was a knock at my door. Lisa stood on my porch, looking tired and drawn. "I've been having dreams," she said without preamble, "about the trail, about boots in a clearing." I let her in, relief flooding through me. "Me too. What's happening to us, Dan?" I showed her my research, the pattern of disappearances, my conversation with Dr. Reed, the folklore about spirit circles. "This is insane," she said, but without conviction. "We're park rangers. We deal in facts in search and rescue operations, in wilderness training and conservation. Not whatever this is. I know, but I've tried explaining it any other way and I can't. Something is happening in those woods, Lisa. Something that took Marcus Reeves and 11 others over the years, and for some reason, it's showing itself to us." She was quiet for a moment. "The dreams, in mine, they tell me I need to go back, that there's something I need to see." I nodded. "Mine too. I was just about to head out when you arrived." Lisa took a deep breath. "Then let's go together. But this time we bring emergency locator beacons, satellite phones, the works. And we tell someone where we're going. We filed a hiking plan at the ranger station, telling our supervisor we were doing one final search for evidence in the Marcus Reeves case. We didn't mention clearings or boots or dreams, just a standard search operation. Armed with every piece of navigation and emergency equipment we could carry, we set out for the center of the circle I'd mapped. The place where, according to local legend, the boundary between worlds was thinnest. The hike took most of the day. It was late afternoon when we reached the approximate location, a nondescript section of forest that looked like any other. Tall trees, undergrowth, the occasional small clearing. "Nothing unusual here," Lisa said, sounding both relieved and disappointed. We set up a small camp, planning to do a more thorough search of the area in the morning light. As the sun set, we sat by our small camp stove, eating freeze-dried meals in silence, both lost in our own thoughts. That's when we heard it. The now familiar sound of footsteps in the forest around us, not approaching, just circling. And this time there was something else. A faint humming or singing, almost too quiet to hear. Lisa's eyes met mine. "You hear that too?" I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. The mist began to form again, rolling in from nowhere, curling around the trees and creeping toward our campsite. With it came that strange luminescence, casting everything in a pale blue glow. "Dan," Lisa whispered, pointing. The trees around us were changing, their forms twisting, branches reaching out like arms, trunks bending in ways that wood shouldn't be able to bend. And beyond them, where there had been solid forest moments before, a clearing was opening up. Not small like the one I'd found before, but enormous. A perfect circle at least 100 feet across, and at its center, not boots this time, but what looked like doorways. Dozens of them standing unsupported in the middle of the clearing. Each one was different. Some looked like traditional wooden doors, others like stone archways, still others like nothing I could describe in human terms. Silhouettes moved among the doorways, human-shaped, but not quite human. And I recognized them from my dreams. The missing hikers, each one near a different doorway. "They're showing us," Lisa said, her voice barely audible. "Showing us where they went." I realized she was right. Each figure was standing beside a doorway as if waiting, beckoning us to understand something profound and terrifying. "We shouldn't be seeing this," I said. "No one's meant to see this and return." Lisa's hand found mine in the gathering darkness. "Then why us? Why show us?" The answer came not in words, but in understanding that seemed to flow directly into my mind. We were witnesses, chosen because we had the capacity to see and yet remain anchored to our world, to remember, to know that those who vanished weren't lost in the conventional sense. They had found doorways to somewhere else, and they had chosen to step through. As we watched, frozen between terror and awe, Marcus Reeves's figure separated from the others and approached us. He stopped at the edge of our campsite, more substantial now than the other figures, almost solid-looking in the strange light. "Now you understand," he said, his voice the same one from my dreams. "Some hikers never leave the trail because they find a different path, a different journey." "Are you dead?" Lisa asked, her scientific mind still searching for rational categories. Marcus smiled. "No more than you are, just elsewhere, walking different woods." "Why show us this?" I asked. "Why not just let people believe you fell or got lost or were taken by wildlife?" "Because sometimes the woods need witnesses," he replied. "People who know the truth, even if they never share it. It helps maintain the balance." "What balance?" "Between your world and ours. Between knowing and not knowing." He began to fade, becoming translucent. "You should go now. Dawn is coming, and these doorways will close. This isn't your time to choose." "Choose?" Lisa echoed. "We all make choices on the trail," Marcus said, now barely visible. "Some of us choose doors you can't yet see," and then he was gone. The clearing remained for a moment longer, the doorways glimmering in the mist, the silhouettes of the missing standing sentinel beside them. Then, like a dream dissolving upon waking, it all faded away. Dawn broke over an ordinary stretch of forest. Our camp was intact, our equipment untouched. According to our GPS, we were exactly where we had set up camp the night before, but we both knew what we had seen. We hiked back to the ranger station in silence, each processing what we had witnessed. Our satellite phones worked perfectly, our GPS devices showed normal readings, and when we checked in at the station, everything was business as usual, except that nothing would ever be usual again. In the days that followed, Lisa and I made an unspoken agreement not to discuss what we had seen, not even with each other. We filed our report on the Marcus Reeves search. Negative results, no evidence found, case status unchanged. Life at Shenandoah National Park continued. Hikers came and went, tourists photographed the spectacular fall foliage, rangers patrolled the trails and provided assistance where needed. Normal, everyday occurrences in a place that I now knew held secrets far beyond the ordinary. The dreams stopped. Whatever message the forest and its inhabitants had wanted to convey to us had been delivered. We were witnesses. Nothing more. 3 months passed. Winter descended on the mountains. bringing with it snow and fewer visitors. I found myself hiking alone more often, drawn to the quiet trails that wound through the dormant forest. I never again found the circular clearing with the boots, never saw the doorways or the silhouettes of the missing. But I felt their presence in the woods around me, not threatening, just aware. And I was aware of them in return. In late January, a family reported their daughter missing. Ellie Watson, 19 years old, an experienced solo hiker who'd gone out for a day hike and never returned. The search began immediately. Teams combing the snow-covered trails, helicopters scanning from above. I was assigned to the eastern sector, the same area where Marcus had disappeared. As I hiked through the silent, snow-draped forest, I felt a familiar sensation, the feeling of being watched from between the trees. The footsteps came again, crunching in the snow behind me. I stopped and turned slowly, expecting to see nothing as I had before. But there she was, Ellie Watson, standing about 20 feet away, dressed in the same hiking clothes described in the missing person report, looking perfectly fine. No signs of exposure, no injuries, no distress. "Ellie," I called out. "I'm Ranger Cooper. Your family's looking for you." She smiled. The same serene smile I'd seen on Marcus's face in my dreams. "I know, but I'm not lost." "Let me take you back," I said, approaching slowly. "Everyone's worried." She shook her head. "I found a doorway, Ranger Cooper. I've made my choice." My blood ran cold. "Ellie, whatever you think you've found, you need to come back with me." "You've seen them too," she said. It wasn't a question. "The circles, the doors, you know they're real." I couldn't deny it. "Yes, but that doesn't mean you should." "I'm not the first," she interrupted, "and I won't be the last. Some people find exactly what they're looking for in these woods, even if they didn't know they were looking for it." She began to back away from me, still smiling. "You're a witness, Ranger Cooper. That's your purpose. Not to prevent, not to interfere, just to know the truth." "Wait," I called, starting after her. But as I tried to follow, the snow beneath my feet deepened impossibly, slowing me down, while she moved effortlessly, widening the distance between us. She stopped at the edge of the tree line. "Tell my family I'm not suffering. Tell them I found my way." And then she was gone, stepping behind a large pine tree. When I finally reached it, breathing hard from struggling through the deep snow, there was nothing on the other side. No footprints leading away, no sign anyone had been there at all. Just like Marcus Reeves, Ellie Watson had vanished without a trace. I reported the encounter, of course. Said I'd spotted her, but she'd run away, that I'd lost her trail in the snow. I didn't mention doorways or choices or messages for her family. Who would believe me? The search continued for another week before being scaled back. Ellie Watson joined the list of people who had entered these woods and never emerged. At least, not into the world they'd left behind. Was she truly at peace, as she'd claimed? Had Marcus and the others really found something beyond our ordinary existence? Or was there a more sinister explanation? Some force in the forest that lured people away with false promises and gentle smiles? I don't know. I may never know. What I do know is this. When you walk the trails of Shenandoah, you're never truly alone. The forest watches, it evaluates, and for some, it offers doorways to somewhere else, places we can glimpse but not fully comprehend. I still work as a ranger. I still help lost hikers find their way back to safety. But sometimes, when I'm deep in the woods and I hear footsteps behind me, or my name called from between the trees, I wonder, are they lost, or am I? If you enjoyed this journey into the mysteries of Shenandoah National Park, hit that subscribe button to join me for more stories that blur the line between reality and the unknown. Have you ever felt watched while hiking alone? Ever heard your name called when no one was there? Share your experiences in the comments below. I read every single one, And if you have theories about what happened to Marcus Reeves and the others who vanished without a trace, I'd love to hear them. Until next time, sweet dreams if you can sleep after this story. And remember, when you're hiking, always tell someone where you're going, because some trails lead to places not marked on any map. Story number 3. Have you ever felt like a house was watching you? Not just the people inside, but the actual building itself. Those walls that seem to lean in just a little too close when you're alone. That creaking floorboard that only sounds when you're trying to sleep. That cold spot in the hallway that makes your skin crawl every time you walk through it. What if I told you there's a house in America that doesn't just watch, it whispers? A house where perfectly normal people have gone insane within weeks of moving in. A house that knows your deepest fears and uses them against you. Today, I'm going to tell you the story of the Henderson House in Willow Creek, Michigan. A story that's been buried by local authorities for decades. Until now. If you're listening to this in bed, you might want to check that your doors are locked. And maybe sleep with the lights on tonight. Because once you hear this story, you'll never look at your own home the same way again. The story begins now. Thomas Miller never expected to inherit a house, especially not one worth nearly $1 million in today's market. He was a 32-year-old elementary school teacher living in a cramped apartment in Chicago, struggling to pay off his student loans. So when the letter arrived from a law firm in Willow Creek, Michigan, informing him that his great-aunt Judith had passed away and left him her Victorian mansion, he was shocked. Great-aunt Judith? He had asked his mother over the phone. I don't remember any great-aunt Judith. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. She was estranged from the family, his mother finally said. Your grandfather's sister. They had a falling out before you were born. Thomas could tell by her tone that there was more to the story. What kind of falling out? Another pause. Nothing important, honey. Just family drama from a long time ago. Thomas wasn't convinced, but he let it go. A house was a house, and free was free. 2 weeks later, he stood in front of 1723 Sycamore Lane, staring up at his new home. The Henderson House, as the locals called it, was a towering 3-story Victorian with peeling gray paint and black shutters that hung crookedly from the windows. A wrought iron fence surrounded the property, its gate squeaking in protest as Thomas pushed it open. Despite its run-down appearance, the house had good bones, high ceilings, ornate woodwork, stained glass windows that cast colorful patterns across the hardwood floors when the sun hit them just right. Nothing that a fresh coat of paint and some basic repairs couldn't fix. The realtor who'd given him the keys had seemed eager to leave. Just sign here, she'd said, sliding the papers across her desk without meeting his eyes. And congratulations on your inheritance. As Thomas had reached for the pen, he noticed her hand had a slight tremor. Is something wrong? He asked. She forced a smile. Not at all. It's just, well, the house has been empty for quite some time. It might need more work than you expect. That was an understatement. As Thomas explored his new home that first day, he discovered that the plumbing leaked, the electricity was unreliable, and there was a distressing amount of mold in the basement. But these were all problems that could be fixed. He'd take a few weeks off from teaching, roll up his sleeves and make this place livable before the next school year started. That first night, Thomas slept on an air mattress in what would become his bedroom. The autumn wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the house a door kept creaking open and closed. Open and closed. The sound should have been annoying, but Thomas was too exhausted to care. He drifted off to sleep with the sound of the creaking door as his lullaby. He dreamed of a woman standing at the foot of his mattress. Her face was obscured by shadow, but he could see that she wore an old-fashioned dress with a high collar. You shouldn't have come here, she whispered. None of them should have come. Thomas jolted awake, heart pounding. The room was pitch black, but he could have sworn he felt someone watching him from the corner. He fumbled for his phone and turned on the flashlight, illuminating the empty room. Just a dream. It was just a dream. The next morning, Thomas drove into town to buy supplies and introduce himself to the locals. Willow Creek was a small town, the kind where everyone knew everyone else's business. As he walked into the hardware store, conversations stopped. Eyes turned to stare at him. "Can I help you?" asked the elderly man behind the counter, his tone not particularly helpful. "I hope so," Thomas said with a smile. "I just moved into the old house on Sycamore Lane. It needs some work." The man's expression hardened. The Henderson place. It wasn't a question, but Thomas nodded anyway. "That's right. I inherited it from my great-aunt." "Judith Henderson was your aunt?" The man eyed him suspiciously. "Great-aunt, yes, though I never met her." The man seemed to be weighing his words carefully. "That house, it's got history." "Most old houses do," Thomas replied, trying to keep his tone light. "Not like this one." The man leaned forward. "People don't tend to stay there long." A chill ran down Thomas's spine. "What do you mean?" The man opened his mouth to respond, but the bell above the door jingled as another customer entered. "Nothing," he said, straightening up. "Just that it's an old house. Maintenance can be a headache. Now, what supplies did you need?" Thomas left the hardware store with his supplies and an uneasy feeling. As he loaded his purchases into his car, a woman approached him. She was in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and sharp blue eyes that reminded Thomas of a hawk. "You're staying in the Henderson house," she said without preamble. Thomas sighed. Small towns. "Yes, I am. I'm Margaret Winters. I live across the street." "Thomas Miller. Nice to meet you, neighbor." Margaret didn't return his smile. "That house, it's not right." Thomas resisted the urge to roll his eyes. What was with these people? "It needs some work, but—" "No," Margaret cut him off. "It's not the structure. It's the house itself. It does things to people." Thomas stared at her. "Does things?" Margaret glanced around as if checking to see if anyone was listening. "Your great-aunt, she wasn't the only one who lived there and—" She trailed off, seeming to reconsider her words. "Just be careful. Don't listen to the whispers." Before Thomas could ask what she meant, Margaret turned and walked away, leaving him standing beside his car with a growing sense of unease. That night, as Thomas lay in bed, he couldn't stop thinking about Margaret's warning. Don't listen to the whispers. What whispers? The house was silent except for the occasional creak of settling wood, until it wasn't. At first, Thomas thought it was the wind. A soft, hushed sound barely audible over the ticking of his watch. But as he strained to listen, he realized it was coming from inside the walls. A faint, rhythmic sound that almost sounded like someone breathing. Thomas sat up, fully awake now. "Hello?" he called out, feeling foolish. "Is someone there?" The breathing stopped. Silence filled the room, heavier and more oppressive than before. Then, so quietly that Thomas might have imagined it. "Welcome home, Thomas." Thomas jumped out of bed, heart racing. He grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight, scanning the room. Nothing. No one. He was alone. Wasn't he? The next few days passed in a blur of repair work and unpacking. Thomas did his best to ignore the strange occurrences that seemed to be increasing in frequency. The whispers in the walls that he heard just as he was falling asleep. The doors that closed themselves when his back was turned. The cold spots that moved around the house, following him from room to room. It was an old house, he told himself. Old houses had quirks. And he'd been watching too many horror movies. A week after moving in, Thomas decided to explore the attic. He'd been putting it off, partly because of the amount of work the main living areas needed, and partly because, well, The thought of the attic made him uneasy, but it was silly to leave any part of his new home unexplored. The pull-down ladder creaked ominously as Thomas climbed into the dusty space. Cobwebs clung to his hair, and the air felt thick and stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed in decades. The only light came from the small round window at the far end of the attic, casting everything in a dim gray glow. The attic was surprisingly full. Furniture draped in dusty sheets, trunks and boxes stacked against the sloped ceiling. A rocking chair that seemed to move slightly in the still air. Thomas moved carefully through the clutter, pulling back sheets to reveal antique dressers, a vanity table with a cracked mirror, and a child's rocking horse with one eye missing. His great-aunt had apparently been something of a hoarder. At the back of the attic, Thomas found a small desk. Unlike the other furniture, it wasn't covered with a sheet. In fact, it looked relatively dust-free, as if someone had been using it recently. A leather-bound book sat on its surface. Thomas picked up the book. It was a journal, the pages yellow with age. The handwriting was cramped and urgent, as if the writer had been in a hurry. July 17th, 1952, Thomas read aloud. The whispering started again last night. Henry says he doesn't hear it, but I know he's lying. I see the way he looks at the walls when he thinks I'm not watching. The house is getting to him, too. Thomas flipped through the pages, scanning entries at random. August 3rd, 1952. Henry threw out all the knives today, said he didn't trust himself with them anymore. When I asked what he meant, he just stared at me with those vacant eyes. He hasn't been sleeping. August 10th, 1952. Found Henry sleepwalking again. He was standing in front of the bedroom mirror, whispering to himself. When I woke him, he became agitated, said they told him to do things. When I asked who they were, he just pointed to the walls. August 15th, 1952. Henry's gone. Left a note saying he needed to get away from the voices. Called the police, but they said he's a grown man and can leave if he wants to. They don't understand. The house won't let him go that easily. Thomas closed the journal, his hands trembling slightly. The entries continued for several more months, growing increasingly paranoid and disjointed. The final entry, dated December 25th, 1952, simply read, "The house is alive. God help us all." Who had written this? His great-aunt. But Margaret had said Judith wasn't the only one who'd lived in the house. Perhaps this belonged to previous owners. Thomas tucked the journal into his pocket. He'd read the rest later. For now, he wanted out of the attic. The air felt thicker than before, pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. As he moved toward the ladder, Thomas's foot caught on something. He looked down to see a small wooden box partially hidden beneath a sheet. Curious despite his unease, he knelt and pulled it out. The box was intricately carved with symbols Thomas didn't recognize. It looked old, very old, and was surprisingly heavy for its size. There was no lock, but the lid seemed stuck. Thomas pried at it with his fingers, and with a reluctant groan, it opened. Inside was a collection of old photographs, yellow with age. Thomas picked up the top one. It showed a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children, standing in front of the Henderson house. They were smiling, but something about their expression seemed forced, unnatural. Thomas turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded ink, "The Carlson family, 1935. Thomas flipped through more photographs. Different families, different years, but all standing in front of the same house. His house. In the earlier photos, the families were smiling. In the later ones, their expressions grew increasingly strained, their eyes hollow. The final photograph was of a single woman, elderly, stern-faced, with eyes that seemed to pierce through the camera. On the back, Judith Henderson, 1998. His great-aunt. The resemblance to his mother was unmistakable. As Thomas stared at the photograph, he could have sworn the eyes moved, shifting to look directly at him. He dropped the photograph as if it had burned him. Enough. He'd had enough attic exploration for one day. As Thomas descended the ladder, he thought he heard a whisper from behind him. "You can't escape either, Thomas." He whirled around, but the attic was empty, just dusty furniture and shadows. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the journal, the photographs, Margaret's warning. Don't listen to the whispers. But what if the whispers weren't coming from the house at all? What if they were coming from inside his own head? Thomas got up and paced the room. Was he losing his mind? No, that was ridiculous. He was a rational, educated man. He didn't believe in haunted houses or curses. And yet, there's a logical explanation for everything, he said aloud, his voice sounding hollow in the empty room. "Is there?" whispered a voice from the darkness. Thomas froze. That voice hadn't been in his head. It had been right beside him, so close he could feel the breath on his ear. But when he turned, there was no one there. The changes were subtle at first. Thomas would find himself standing in rooms with no memory of how he'd gotten there. He'd look up from a book to realize hours had passed in what felt like minutes. He'd catch glimpses of movement in mirrors, shadows that didn't match his own. And the whispers, they were getting louder. No longer confined to the walls, they seemed to follow him throughout the house, a constant hissing undercurrent to his thoughts. "You belong here, Thomas. We've been waiting for you. You'll never leave." 2 weeks after moving in, Thomas realized he hadn't left the house in 3 days. He hadn't called anyone, hadn't checked his email, hadn't even gone outside to get the mail. He'd been so absorbed in what? He couldn't remember what he'd been doing. His phone rang, startling him. It was his mother. "Thomas, are you okay? I've been trying to reach you for days." "I'm fine, Mom," Thomas said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "Just busy with the house." "The house," his mother repeated, and Thomas could hear the worry in her voice. "Thomas, maybe you should come home for a while. Take a break." "I can't leave," Thomas said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "The house needs me." "The house? Thomas, what are you talking about?" Thomas blinked, suddenly aware of what he'd said. "I mean, there's still so much to do here, repairs and stuff." "Thomas, listen to me." His mother's voice was urgent now. "That house. There's a reason Aunt Judith was estranged from the family. She changed after she moved in there. Became paranoid, violent. Your grandfather tried to help her, but she wasn't herself anymore." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you saying, Mom?" "I'm saying you need to come home. Now. Sell the house, give it away, I don't care. Just get out of there." "I can't," Thomas whispered, and he was horrified to realize it was true. The thought of leaving filled him with inexplicable dread. "The house won't let me." "Thomas," he hung up, his hand shaking. What was happening to him? Thomas went to the bathroom and splashed cold water on his face. When he looked up at the mirror, a stranger stared back at him. His eyes were sunken, his skin pale. How long had he looked like this? And behind him, reflected in the mirror, was a figure. A woman in an old-fashioned dress, her face obscured by shadow. Thomas whirled around, but the bathroom was empty. When he looked back at the mirror, the woman was gone, but his own reflection seemed to be smiling now, a smile he wasn't making. Thomas stumbled backward out of the bathroom. He needed to leave, now, just for a little while. Clear his head. He grabbed his keys and headed for the front door. As he reached for the knob, the whispers rose to a screaming pitch. "You can't leave. You belong here. You'll die out there." Thomas covered his ears, but the voices were inside his head now, impossible to block out. The door handle felt burning hot under his fingers. When he tried to turn it, it refused to budge. "Let me out," Thomas shouted, yanking at the door handle. "Let me out!" "We need you, Thomas," came a soft voice behind him. Thomas turned to see the woman from his dream, from the mirror. She stood in the hallway, her face still in shadow. "Who are you?" Thomas demanded, pressing his back against the door. "Don't you recognize your own family?" the woman asked, stepping forward into the light. It was his great-aunt Judith, exactly as she'd looked in the photograph. But that was impossible. Judith was dead. "You're not real," Thomas whispered. "You're in my head. I'm as real as this house," Judith said, gesturing around her. "As real as the others." Others? As if on cue, figures began to appear behind Judith. Men, women, children, dozens of them, all with the same hollow eyes and unnatural smiles. Thomas recognized some of them from the photographs in the attic. "We're all part of the house now," Judith said, "and soon you will be too." Thomas slid down the door until he was sitting on the floor, his knees pulled up to his chest. "This isn't happening," he muttered. "This isn't real." "The house has been waiting for you, Thomas," Judith continued, as if he hadn't spoken. "It needs fresh blood, new life. It's been so hungry." "I'm losing my mind," Thomas whispered. "That's what this is. I'm having a psychotic break." Judith smiled, a terrible, empty smile. "That's what they all say at first." The other figures were moving closer now, forming a circle around Thomas. Their mouths opened in unison, but the voice that came out was the house's whisper, amplified 100-fold. "Welcome home, Thomas." Thomas screamed. When Thomas opened his eyes, sunlight was streaming through the windows. He was lying on the floor by the front door, his body stiff and sore. Had he fallen asleep there? Had it all been a dream? But as he stood up, he noticed scratches on the door. Long, deep gouges in the wood, as if someone, or something, had been desperately trying to claw their way out. Had he done that? Thomas rubbed his hands over his face, trying to clear his head. He needed to get out of this house, now, before he completely lost his grip on reality. He tried the door handle. It turned easily, the door swinging open to reveal a beautiful autumn day. Thomas almost sobbed with relief as he stepped outside, the cool air a blessing against his clammy skin. He would go to town, call his mother, make arrangements to leave. He'd give the house away, burn it down, whatever it took. He just needed to get away. As Thomas drove into Willow Creek, he felt the fog in his mind beginning to lift. By the time he parked in front of the small cafe on Main Street, he was almost feeling like himself again. The cafe was nearly empty, just a couple of older men playing chess in the corner. The woman behind the counter looked up as Thomas entered, her eyes widening slightly. "You're the one staying at the Henderson place," she said. Thomas sighed. Was there anyone in this town who didn't know where he lived? That's right. The woman studied him for a moment. "You don't look so good." "I haven't been sleeping well," Thomas admitted, sitting at the counter. "Could I get a coffee, please? And do you have a phone I could use? My cell is... I think I left it at the house." The woman nodded, pouring him a cup of coffee. "Phone's in the back. Help yourself." Thomas thanked her and went to make his call. His mother answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting by the phone. "Thomas, thank God, I've been so worried." "Mom, you were right," Thomas said, keeping his voice low. "There's something wrong with the house. I need to leave." "Oh, honey," his mother's voice broke. "Where are you now?" "In town. I'm going to see about a hotel room until I can figure out what to do with the house." "Don't go back there, Thomas. Not even to pack. I'll wire you money for clothes, whatever you need. Just don't go back." Thomas felt a weight lift from his shoulders at his mother's words. He wasn't crazy. She knew there was something wrong with the house, too. "Okay, Mom. I promise." After hanging up, Thomas returned to the counter, feeling more hopeful than he had in days. He'd stay in town, make arrangements to sell the house without ever setting foot in it again. He'd get through this. As he sipped his coffee, the door to the cafe opened. Margaret Winters walked in, stopping short when she saw Thomas. "You're out," she said, sounding surprised. "I am," Thomas confirmed, "and I'm not going back." Margaret sat beside him at the counter. "They all say that." Thomas felt a chill at her words. "What do you mean?" Margaret sighed. "I've lived across from that house for 40 years. Seen a lot of people move in, they all leave eventually, one way or another." "What happens to them?" Thomas asked, not sure he wanted to know the answer. "Most leave like you're planning to, run away, never come back. Some," Margaret hesitated, "some don't make it out at all." Thomas thought of the journal he'd found, of Henry who'd needed to get away from the voices. "And what happens to the ones who leave? Do they recover?" Margaret gave him a sad smile. "For a while. But the house, it gets in your head, becomes a part of you, and sooner or later it calls you back." Thomas felt his newfound hope beginning to falter. "So, what am I supposed to do? Live in fear for the rest of my life?" "There might be a way," Margaret said, lowering her voice. "A way to end it, once and for all." Thomas leaned closer. "Tell me." "The house feeds on life, on fear, on madness. It's been doing it for generations, growing stronger with each new occupant. But what if there were no more occupants?" "You mean, destroy the house?" Margaret nodded. "Burn it to the ground, salt the earth, make sure nothing can ever be built there again." Thomas considered this. Could it really be that simple? Have others tried? A few, but the house, it doesn't want to die, it fights back. Thomas thought of the locked door, the voices screaming in his head. Yeah, the house would definitely fight back. "I'd need help." "You'd have it," Margaret assured him. "There are people in this town who've lost loved ones to that house, people who would help." Thomas made his decision. "Tonight, then. We end this tonight." The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparations. Margaret introduced Thomas to others who had been affected by the house. A man whose brother had hanged himself in the attic. A woman whose mother had slowly wasted away inside those walls. A couple whose daughter had disappeared after exploring the abandoned property on a dare. They gathered supplies: gasoline, salt, torches. They planned their approach, their escape routes. As the sun began to set, Thomas felt a strange mix of dread and determination. He was going back to the house one last time. The small group gathered at the end of Sycamore Lane as darkness fell. The Henderson house loomed ahead of them, its windows like watching eyes. Was it Thomas's imagination, or did the house look expectant, as if it knew they were coming? "Remember," Margaret said to the group, "whatever you see, whatever you hear, it's not real. It's the house trying to stop you. Focus on the task." They nodded, faces grim in the fading light. Thomas took a deep breath and led the way through the creaking gate. With each step toward the house, he felt a growing pressure in his head, a whisper at the edge of his consciousness. "They can't help you, Thomas. You're already ours. Come home, Thomas. Come home." Thomas gritted his teeth and kept walking. At the front door, he hesitated, then pushed it open. It swung inward without resistance, as if welcoming them. The house was dark inside, darker than it should have been given the streetlights outside. Thomas fumbled for the light switch, but nothing happened when he flipped it. "Flashlights," he said, and the group turned on their flashlights, the beams cutting through the darkness like knives. The plan was simple. Spread the gasoline throughout the first floor, focusing on load-bearing walls and dry materials that would burn easily. Then get out, throw in the torches, and watch the house burn. Simple, But as the group began to move through the house, things started to go wrong. First, they became separated, each person somehow wandering into different rooms despite their intention to stay together. Then the whispers started, different for each person, playing on their deepest fears and secret guilt. For Thomas, the whispers became his mother's voice, pleading, accusing. "Why are you doing this, Thomas? This is your home now, your legacy, your family's legacy. Would you destroy it? Destroy me?" Thomas tried to block out the voice, focusing on his task. He was in the living room, emptying a can of gasoline over the antique furniture. The smell was making him lightheaded, the fumes mixing with the already oppressive air of the house. A movement caught his eye. In the doorway stood a figure, not his great-aunt this time, but a young man about his own age, with familiar features that Thomas recognized from looking in the mirror. "Who are you?" Thomas asked, though deep down he already knew. "I'm you," the figure said. "Or what you'll become if you stay. Part of the house, part of the family." Thomas shook his head. "This isn't real. You're not real. Aren't I?" The figure stepped closer. "Feel for yourself." Against his better judgment, Thomas reached out. His hand didn't pass through the figure as he'd expected. Instead, it touched solid flesh, cold as ice, but undeniably there. Thomas stumbled backward, his heel catching on the edge of the rug. He fell, the gasoline can clattering to the floor, spilling its remaining contents. "You can't destroy the house, Thomas," his doppelganger said, still advancing. "The house is you now. Destroy it, and you destroy yourself." Was that true? Thomas thought of the past weeks, of the whispers that had become part of his thoughts, the house that had become part of his identity. Maybe it was too late for him. But not for others, not for future victims. With sudden resolve, Thomas stood up. "Then I guess we both burn," he said, pulling a lighter from his pocket. The doppelganger's confident expression faltered. "You wouldn't." Thomas flicked the lighter, the small flame casting eerie shadows across the room. "Watch me." "Thomas, no." It was Margaret, rushing into the room. "Not like this. We need to get out first." Thomas looked at her, then back at his doppelganger. But the figure was gone, as if it had never been there. Had any of it been real? "The others," Thomas said, suddenly remembering the rest of their group. "Where are they?" "Outside already," Margaret assured him. "It's just us now. We need to go." Thomas nodded, moving toward the door. But as he reached it, an invisible force slammed it shut. Around them, other doors began to close, windows shuttering themselves. The house was sealing them in. The whispers rose to a deafening roar. "Mine! You're all mine!" Margaret looked at Thomas, fear and determination warring in her eyes. "We have to finish it, now." Thomas understood. They were trapped. Their only choice was to complete the plan from the inside. He looked down at the lighter in his hand, still burning. "It ends here," he said, and dropped the lighter onto the gasoline-soaked carpet. The flames caught immediately, racing across the floor faster than Thomas had expected. He grabbed Margaret's hand and they ran for the kitchen, where they'd seen a door leading to the backyard. The smoke was already thickening, making it hard to see, hard to breathe. The house groaned around them, a sound of anger and pain. The whispers had become screams, both in Thomas's head and somehow in the very air. "You can't escape. You'll die with me. You're mine forever." They reached the kitchen door, only to find it wouldn't open. Margaret pulled at the handle while Thomas slammed his shoulder against it again and again. The flames were spreading rapidly now, feeding on the old, dry wood of the house. The heat was becoming unbearable, the smoke choking. "The window," Margaret coughed, pointing to the small window above the sink. "We can break it." Thomas grabbed a chair and smashed it against the window. The glass shattered outward. Outside, he could see the rest of their group, faces pale in the growing firelight. "Margaret first," Thomas insisted, helping her up onto the counter. She was small enough to fit through the window, and with Thomas's boost, she was able to climb out. Thomas tried to follow, but as he pulled himself up, something grabbed his ankle. He looked down to see a hand emerging from the floor, wrapping skeletal fingers around his leg. "The house!" He gasped. More hands were appearing now, reaching for him from the walls, the floor, the spreading flames. The whispers were back, but different now, pleading, desperate. "Don't leave us, Thomas. We need you. We're your family." Thomas saw faces in the flames. Judith, the doppelganger, countless others he didn't recognize, all watching him, all reaching for him. With a final surge of strength, Thomas kicked free of the skeletal hand and pulled himself through the window. He tumbled to the ground outside, where Margaret and the others helped him to his feet. Together, they ran to the safety of the street. From there, they watched as the Henderson house burned. The flames reached higher and higher, consuming the walls, the roof, everything. The screams were audible even outside now, a chorus of inhuman voices wailing in agony. And then, silence. The house continued to burn, but the voices were gone. The oppressive feeling that had hung over Sycamore Lane for generations seemed to lift, like a fog blown away by a fresh wind. "Is it over?" Thomas asked, his voice hoarse from the smoke. Margaret squeezed his hand. "I think so." But as Thomas watched the house collapse in on itself, he couldn't shake the feeling that something of it remained. Not in the physical world, perhaps, but somewhere inside him. A whisper, a memory, a part of himself he'd never quite get back. And sometimes, even now, in the dark of night, he thinks he can still hear it calling to him. So, did you enjoy the story of the Henderson house? A tale of madness, family secrets, and a hunger that spans generations? I'd love to know what you think happened to Thomas after that night. Did he truly escape the curse, or is the house still whispering to him, waiting for him to return? What do you think was really happening in that house all those years? Share your theories in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling tales that will keep you up at night. And if you know of any other supposedly cursed places in America, leave those in the comments too. They might inspire my next story. Until next time, sleep tight. And maybe check under your bed before you turn off the lights. Sometimes, the monsters we fear aren't just in old houses. They're in our own minds. And remember, even after you close this video, the whispers might follow you home. Story number 4. Hey there, night owls and thrill seekers. Before we dive into tonight's journey through America's most bone-chilling urban legends, I need you to do something for me. Check your doors. Are they locked? How about your windows? Because the stories I'm about to share aren't just tales passed around campfires or whispered in dorm rooms. They're the shadows that follow you home, the unexplained sounds in your attic, and the figures you glimpse from the corner of your eye. If you're brave enough to continue listening, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. And when you're done, drop a comment telling me which legend kept you up at night. Or share your own hometown horror story. I read every comment, and the best ones might just inspire our next video. Now, get comfortable. Or as comfortable as you can be when facing the unknown. Our story begins now. Growing up in small-town Ohio, Jessica Winters never believed in monsters. Not the ones under the bed or the shadows in the closet. But that changed during the summer of 1998, when she was just 16 years old. It was the hottest July on record, and the kind of humidity that made your clothes stick to your skin hung in the air like an unwelcome guest. "You have to try it," her best friend Amber insisted one lazy afternoon as they sprawled across her living room floor, the ceiling fan doing little to combat the heat. "My cousin from Michigan told me about it." "About what?" Jessica asked, barely looking up from her magazine. "The Static Man." Amber sat up, eyes wide with excitement. They say if you tune an analog TV to a dead channel at exactly 3:33 a.m. and you're alone, you can hear him whispering through the static. Jessica rolled her eyes. And what does this static man supposedly say? That's the thing. Amber leaned closer, lowering her voice. He tells you something nobody else could possibly know. Something about yourself, or something that's going to happen to you. Jessica laughed it off, but later that night, lying in her bed, the box fan in her window doing little more than pushing hot air around her room, she couldn't stop thinking about it. The static man. What would he tell her? Her parents were heavy sleepers, and their bedroom was on the opposite side of the house. Her little brother was away at summer camp. Nobody would know if she tried it, just once. The old TV in the basement hadn't been used in years, not since they'd gotten cable upstairs. Jessica glanced at her bedside clock, 2:58 a.m. Her heart pounded as she slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent on the carpeted stairs. The basement was cooler, but darker. Much darker. She felt her way to the old couch, the familiar musty smell of the underground room filling her nostrils. The ancient TV set sat on a wooden stand covered in a thin layer of dust. Jessica's fingers trembled slightly as she pressed the power button. The screen flickered to life with a low buzz, illuminating the basement in a pale blue glow. She turned the dial slowly, watching as channels gave way to static, the white noise filling the silent house. 3:32 a.m. She settled on a channel of pure static, the black and white dots dancing across the screen hypnotically. Jessica sat back on the couch, feeling slightly foolish. "This is stupid," she whispered to herself. And then the clock changed. 3:33 a.m. At first, nothing happened, just the steady hiss of static. Then, almost imperceptibly, the sound began to change. The random noise started to take on a pattern, like breathing. Like someone breathing very close to a microphone. Jessica leaned forward, straining to hear. Was that a voice? Jessica. She froze, her blood turning to ice water in her veins. The voice was barely audible beneath the static, but it was there. A dry, rasping whisper. Jessica Winters. No one else was home. No one could be playing a prank. The voice grew slightly louder, though still barely a whisper. The red notebook. Look inside the red notebook. Jessica's mind raced. What red notebook? She didn't own a red notebook, did she? The static suddenly increased in volume, making her jump. When it settled again, the voice was gone. Just ordinary white noise filled the room. Jessica sat in the dark basement for several minutes, her heart hammering against her ribs, before finally turning off the TV and creeping back upstairs to her bedroom. She told herself it was her imagination, that she'd been half asleep and had dreamed the whole thing. But the next morning, as she helped her mother clean out the hall closet, she found something pushed to the back of the top shelf. A red notebook, covered in dust. Her mother didn't recognize it. "Must be something your father brought home from work," she said dismissively. That night, alone in her room, Jessica finally worked up the courage to open it. Inside were pages and pages of handwritten entries, in her own handwriting, but she had never seen this notebook before, had never written these words. The entries were dated, with dates that hadn't happened yet. The first entry was for tomorrow, and as Jessica read what she had supposedly written about her own future, her hands began to shake so badly that she dropped the notebook to the floor. The static man had given her a window into her future, and what she saw there made her wish she had never turned on that TV, because some things are better left unknown. Mike Thompson had been driving for 14 hours straight, the endless ribbon of Interstate 70 stretching before him like a never-ending conveyor belt. The coffee from his last stop had gone cold, and the radio stations had devolved into static and late-night talk shows about conspiracy theories and alien abductions. Just 2 more hours, he muttered to himself. rolling down the window to let the crisp autumn air slap him awake. The clock on his dashboard read 1:17 a.m. The highway was nearly empty, just the occasional semi passing in a blur of running lights. Mike was heading back to his apartment in Denver after visiting his folks in Columbus. It was cheaper to drive than fly, and he'd taken a few extra days off work to make the journey. But now, as fatigue crept in around the edges of his vision, he was regretting the decision to power through the night instead of stopping at a motel. The GPS on his phone indicated a rest area just 5 miles ahead. Perfect, he yawned, already anticipating a quick nap in the car before finishing the drive. As he approached the exit, Mike noticed a figure standing at the side of the road. A woman in a pale blue dress, her arm outstretched, thumb extended in the universal sign for hitchhiking. At first, he drove past, but something made him glance in his rearview mirror. She looked so desperate, young, maybe early 20s, and out here in the middle of nowhere. At this hour? This is how horror movies start, Mike told himself, even as he put on his brakes and pulled onto the shoulder about 50 yards ahead of her. He watched in his side mirror as she approached, her walk oddly stiff. She appeared at his passenger window and he rolled it down. "Thank you so much for stopping," she said, her voice soft and slightly tremulous. "I've been here for hours. My car broke down and my phone is dead." Up close, Mike noticed how pale she was, almost translucent in the moonlight. Her blue dress seemed old-fashioned, something his grandmother might have worn in her youth. But her face was young and pretty, if drawn with exhaustion. Against his better judgment, Mike unlocked the passenger door. "Where are you headed?" "Cherry Creek," she replied as she slid into the seat. "In Denver. I'm supposed to be home already. My husband must be worried sick." And that was only a few miles from Mike's own apartment. "What a coincidence," he said, pulling back onto the highway. "I'm headed to Denver, too." The woman, who introduced herself as Sarah, was quiet for most of the drive, occasionally giving directions as they got closer to the city. There was something soothing about her presence, and Mike found his earlier tiredness had vanished. As they approached Cherry Creek, she directed him to turn onto increasingly residential streets, finally pointing to a small blue house with white trim. "This is me," she said softly. "Thank you so much for the ride. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't stopped." "No problem," Mike replied. "Do you want me to wait until you get inside, make sure someone's home?" Sarah smiled gently. "That's very kind, but I'll be fine. My husband will be waiting." As she exited the car, she paused. "Oh, would you like to come in for some coffee? It's the least I can offer after you drove me all this way." Mike hesitated. It was nearly 3 a.m. now, and while coffee sounded heavenly, showing up at a stranger's house at this hour seemed inappropriate. "That's all right," he declined politely. "I should get home. Maybe I can take a rain check?" A flicker of something passed across Sarah's face. Disappointment? Relief? It was gone before Mike could identify it. "Of course," she said. "Maybe next time." And with that, she turned and walked up the path to the front door. Mike waited until she reached the porch before putting his car in drive. As he pulled away, he glanced in his rearview mirror one last time and nearly slammed on his brakes. Sarah wasn't at the door. She wasn't on the porch. She wasn't anywhere to be seen. It had been perhaps 3 seconds since she'd left his car, and she had simply vanished. Unable to shake the unease crawling up his spine, Mike drove home in silence, his mind replaying the strange encounter. The next morning, curiosity got the better of him, and he drove back to the blue house in Cherry Creek. An elderly man was watering flowers in the front yard. Mike pulled up and rolled down his window. "Excuse me, sir," he called. "I'm looking for Sarah. I gave her a ride home last night." The old man's watering can froze in midair. He approached Mike's car slowly. "Son," he said, his voice gravelly with age, Who told you about Sarah? No one told me about her. I picked her up on I-70 last night. Blue dress? Said her car broke down. The old man's face drained of color. My Sarah, my wife Sarah, she died in 1973. Car accident on I-70 coming home to me. Mike felt the blood drain from his face. But that's impossible. You're not the first, the old man interrupted, his eyes suddenly shiny with unshed tears. Every few years, someone shows up here, telling me they gave her a ride, always wearing that blue dress I buried her in. Mike's mouth went dry. Why would she? The old man's gaze shifted to the house. She's just trying to come home to me, but she never makes it past the front yard. He looked back at Mike, his expression suddenly sharp. Did she invite you in for coffee? Mutely, Mike nodded. Next time, the old man said, his voice barely above a whisper, you should accept. Mike never drove that stretch of I-70 at night again, but sometimes, on sleepless nights, he wonders what would have happened if he'd accepted Sarah's invitation for coffee. And if the old man is still waiting for the day his wife finally makes it through the front door. Camp Clearwater had been operational in the pine forests of northern Minnesota since 1962, hosting generations of summer campers. Ben Erickson had been coming here since he was 8 years old, graduating from camper to counselor in training and finally, at 19, to full-fledged counselor. He loved everything about it. The crisp air scented with pine, the glassy lake perfect for cannonballs off the wooden dock, and especially the campfire stories. Ben had always been the best storyteller among the counselors, his voice dropping to a whisper at just the right moments, his timing perfect for the jump scares that sent kids squealing into their sleeping bags. But there was one story he never told, the one about the watcher in the woods. Not because it wasn't scary, it was terrifying, but because Camp Director Matthews had expressly forbidden it. That story stays buried, Matthews had told the counselor group during orientation. We don't need kids having nightmares, and we definitely don't need them looking for the Kettle Rock Formation. Kettle Rock was a natural formation deep in the woods beyond the camp boundaries, officially off-limits to campers and staff alike. The rock formation itself wasn't particularly dangerous. A collection of glacier-smoothed boulders arranged in a rough circle around a depression in the ground. But its remote location meant anyone getting lost while looking for it could be in real trouble. The legend, whispered between counselors after lights out, held that in the 1970s a camper had disappeared near Kettle Rock. Search parties found nothing, and eventually the case went cold. But ever since, hikers and campers reported seeing a figure watching them from between the trees, a tall, impossibly thin silhouette that vanished when approached. Some claimed to hear whispers, like the rustling of leaves saying, join me," in the watching. Ben had always dismissed it as typical campfire fare until his third week as a counselor. He was leading his group of 13-year-old boys on an overnight camping trip on one of the established trails. They had set up camp, cooked hot dogs over the fire, and were now tucked into their sleeping bags as Ben told a mild version of the hook. Scary enough to give them a thrill, but not enough to prevent sleep. That's when he noticed one sleeping bag was empty. "Where's Ethan?" he asked, interrupting his own story. The boys looked around, suddenly alert. Ethan Reynolds was the quiet one. The kid who always had his nose in a fantasy novel and seemed perpetually a step removed from the others. He said he was going to the bathroom. Alex, Ethan's tent mate, replied with a shrug. Like 15 minutes ago? Ben's stomach dropped. The designated bathroom area was just behind a stand of trees, no more than 30 yards from their campsite. No one should take 15 minutes. "Stay here," he ordered the group, grabbing his flashlight. "I mean it, no one moves. I'll be right back." The bathroom area was empty. Ben swept his flashlight across the ground looking for footprints, any sign of where Ethan might have gone. The beam caught a flash of white about 10 yards further into the woods. A piece of paper stuck to a tree trunk. Drawing closer, Ben saw it was a page torn from a book, one of Ethan's fantasy novels. There was a crude map drawn on it, with an X marked in what appeared to be the approximate location of Kettle Rock, Ben whispered, his mouth going dry. How would Ethan even know about that? Ben wondered as he plunged deeper into the forest, following what looked like the trail of a small body moving through the underbrush. Broken twigs, disturbed leaves. Another page from a book fluttering from a branch like a bizarre marker. The forest grew denser, the spaces between trees narrowing until Ben had to turn sideways to slip between trunks. His flashlight beam seemed to dim, swallowed by the absolute darkness of the woods at night. That's when he heard it. A soft, rhythmic sound. Like breathing, but not quite. More like the rustling of leaves in a gentle breeze, forming a pattern that almost sounded like words. Join me, join in the watching. Ben's heart hammered against his ribs. Ethan? He called, his voice sounding thin and childlike to his own ears. Ethan, this isn't funny, buddy. We need to get back to camp. The rustling grew louder, more insistent. Join me. See what I see. And then Ben's flashlight beam caught it. The Kettle Rock formation. The boulders formed a rough circle around a depression in the ground, looking unnervingly like a massive eye viewed from above. And standing in the center of that eye was Ethan, his back to Ben, staring up at something in the trees. Ethan! Ben rushed forward, relief flooding through him. Man, you scared the hell out of me. We need to go back right now. The boy didn't move, didn't acknowledge Ben in any way. He just kept staring upward, his body unnaturally still. Ben reached for Ethan's shoulder, but hesitated just before making contact. Something wasn't right. The rustling whisper had stopped. The forest was completely, unnaturally silent. Slowly, Ben raised his flashlight beam to follow Ethan's gaze upward. There, in the branches above Kettle Rock, was a figure. Impossibly tall and thin, its limbs bent at unnatural angles as it clung to the treetops like some massive spider. It had no discernible features, just a darker patch of night against the dark sky, a silhouette that seemed to absorb light rather than simply block it, and it was looking right at Ben. Now you see. Ben grabbed Ethan's arm and pulled, finally breaking whatever trance had held the boy. They ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at their faces. Behind them, the rustling whisper grew to a howl that chased them through the trees. You will join me. They didn't stop running until they reached the campsite, where the other boys were huddled together in terror, having heard the unearthly howl echoing through the forest. Back at the main camp the next morning, Ben reported that they'd been spooked by a coyote. Ethan, oddly, remembered nothing of his midnight wandering. The camp director gave Ben a long, searching look, but asked no further questions. But that night, as Ben lay in his counselor cabin trying to sleep, he noticed something outside his window. A tall, thin shadow against the night sky, watching from just beyond the tree line. And though no one else could hear it, a whisper like rustling leaves filled Ben's dreams. You saw me. Now I see you. Always. Years later, long after Ben had left Camp Clearwater behind, hikers occasionally reported seeing two figures in the woods near Kettle Rock, a possibly tall, thin silhouette, and beside it, a smaller shadow that some swore looked just like a 19-year-old camp counselor, forever trapped in the watching. Absolutely not, Melissa Chen said firmly, crossing her arms as she leaned against the kitchen counter. We are not playing the midnight game in my house. Her four friends, gathered around the kitchen island of her parents' suburban Chicago home, groaned in unison. Come on, Mel, Tyler urged, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper even though they had the house to themselves for the weekend. Your parents won't be back until Sunday night. We've done seances and Ouija boards. This is just the next level." "The next level of stupid," Melissa retorted, though she could feel her resolve weakening. It was their senior year tradition. One sleepover each month, rotating houses, pushing the boundaries of what their parents would allow if they knew, and it was her turn to host. "It's just a game," said Aidan, the skeptic of the group. "A psychological experiment, really. The human mind sees patterns in darkness, creates threats where none exist. That's all the Midnight Man is, a manifestation of our collective fear response." Zoe, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke up. "My cousin played it at college last year," she said softly, twisting a strand of black hair nervously around her finger. "He said it was real, that something followed him home afterward. He wouldn't talk about what he saw." "See?" Melissa gestured at Zoe. "Even Zoe doesn't think this is a good idea, and she's usually the first one to jump into this stuff." "I didn't say we shouldn't do it," Zoe clarified, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of fear and excitement. "I just said we should be careful. Follow the rules exactly." Melissa looked at the final member of their group, her best friend since kindergarten. "Diana? Voice of reason? A little help here?" Diana shrugged, her red hair falling across her shoulders. "I mean, it is tradition, and if we're super careful..." Outnumbered, Melissa finally relented. "Fine, but if my parents' house gets haunted, you're all pitching in for an exorcism." The rules of the midnight game were simple, if bizarre. At exactly 11:55 p.m., each player would write their full name on separate pieces of paper, prick their fingers with a needle, and place a drop of blood on their papers. After placing the papers in front of the front door, they would each light a candle, knock on the door 22 times, the final knock precisely at midnight, open the door, blow out their candles, and close the door. This would supposedly summon the Midnight Man into the house. The objective was to avoid him until 3:33 a.m. by continually moving throughout the darkened house, relighting candles that went out, and using salt as protection if necessary. "This is insane," Melissa muttered as she watched her friends prepare. Tyler had brought everything they needed. Candles, salt, a first aid kit for the finger pricking. Diana had found an old grandfather clock app for her phone that would make the appropriately spooky ticking sound and chime at midnight. At 11:54 p.m., they gathered at the front door, papers with bloody fingerprints in hand, candles lit. "Last chance to back out," Melissa offered. No one moved. At precisely 11:55, Diana started the app. The hollow ticking filled the silent house as they placed their papers before the door and began the knocking sequence. Slow, deliberate knocks, counting together in hushed voices. 1, 2, 3. Melissa's heartbeat seemed to sync with the knocking, a growing sense of dread building with each impact of knuckles on wood. 19, 20, 21. The grandfather clock app began to chime midnight. They knocked the 22nd time in perfect unison with the final chime, then opened the door to the empty night, blew out their candles, and quickly closed the door. The house was plunged into darkness. "Now we relight and start moving," Tyler whispered, the scratch of his lighter oddly loud in the silence. One by one, they relit their candles, the small flames casting long dancing shadows across the walls. "Remember," Zoe murmured, "if your candle goes out, you have 10 seconds to relight it. If you can't, make a circle of salt around yourself and stay there until your candle will light again. And if the room suddenly gets cold, or you see a shadowy figure or hear whispering, that means he's near," Diana added, her voice trembling slightly with excitement or fear, possibly both. "Let's split up," Tyler suggested. "Cover more ground." "Are you insane?" Melissa hissed. "That's literally how people die in horror movies." "We'll go in pairs," Aidan compromised. Tyler and I will take the upstairs. You three take the main floor and basement." Before Melissa could protest further, the boys were heading for the stairs, their candle flames bobbing like fireflies in the darkness. For the first hour, nothing happened. The girls moved through the kitchen, living room, and den, maintaining a careful distance between themselves as the rules required, but staying within eyesight of each other. Occasionally, they would catch glimpses of the boys' candles moving across the upstairs hallway. "This is actually kind of boring," Diana whispered as they entered the second hour. "Maybe Aiden was right. It's all psychological." Her words cut off as her candle suddenly went out. No breeze, no discernible reason. The flame simply vanished. "Crap! Light! I need light!" Diana fumbled with the lighter, her hands shaking too badly to produce a flame. 5 seconds left, Zoe warned, moving closer but not too close. 4, 3... The lighter sparked to life, and Diana's candle reignited just in time. She laughed nervously. "Okay, that was just a coincidence, right?" But moments later, Melissa felt it. A sudden, bone-deep coldness that seemed to emanate not from the air around her, but from inside her own body. Her breath fogged in front of her face, though it was August and the night was warm. "Guys," she whispered, her voice strangled with sudden fear, "do you feel that?" The temperature continued to drop. From upstairs came a shout, followed by running footsteps. Tyler and Aiden appeared at the top of the stairs, their faces pale in the candlelight. "My candle went out," Tyler said, his usual bravado completely gone. "I couldn't relight it. And then I saw something. In the mirror of your parents' bathroom, Mel. It wasn't my reflection looking back at me." A door slammed somewhere in the house, making them all jump. The basement door, Melissa identified, her mouth dry with fear. It was closed when we came through earlier. As they watched, the basement door slowly swung open again, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. A low, rhythmic sound drifted up the stairs, like footsteps slowly ascending. "Salt," Zoe whispered urgently. "Everyone make a circle now." They fumbled with the salt containers, pouring shaky circles around themselves on Melissa's parents' hardwood floor. All 5 candles went out simultaneously, plunging them into absolute darkness. In the pitch black, the footsteps grew louder. A whispering voice, like many voices speaking in unison, seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I see you. I found you." A cold, clammy feeling brushed against Melissa's cheek, like ghostly fingers trailing across her skin. She bit back a scream. The grandfather clock app, who was still running on Diana's phone, suddenly began to chime, though it wasn't the hour. The chimes came faster and faster, blending into a cacophony of sound that made them all clamp their hands over their ears. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The clock fell silent. The temperature returned to normal. The oppressive feeling of being watched vanished. Diana's phone screen illuminated, showing the time. 3:33 a.m. For a long moment, none of them moved or spoke. Finally, Aiden broke the silence. "What was that?" "The Midnight Man," Zoe whispered, her face ashen. It was real. All of it. They spent the remainder of the night huddled together in the living room, lights blazing, jumping at every creak and groan of the house settling. When dawn finally broke, they convinced themselves they had experienced a collective hallucination, a product of suggestion and darkness and their own fears. But in the weeks that followed, each of them noticed changes, shadows that moved independently of their owners, reflections that lingered a moment too long in mirrors, the unmistakable feeling of being watched when they were alone. And sometimes, in the darkness just before sleep claimed them, a whisper that sounded like many voices speaking as one. "The game isn't over. I'm still here." Well, my friends, that brings us to the end of tonight's journey through America's creepiest urban legends. Did you check your doors and windows like I asked? I hope so, because the Midnight Man, the Watcher in the Woods, the Static Man, and the Ghosts of Lonely Highways, they're all waiting for their next invitation. If you enjoyed these tales of terror, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share with someone who needs a good scare. Leave a comment below telling me which legend sent shivers down your spine, or share your own hometown horror story. You never know, your comment might inspire our next video. And remember, just because they're called urban legends doesn't mean they aren't true. Sometimes, the most terrifying stories are the ones that happen to ordinary people on ordinary nights. Just like tonight, sleep tight if you can.